Rabbi, we are up to Daf Kaf Tes in Yerushalmi Peah. We are paying Shlishi Anach Gimel. Okay. Ha'imahos shel b'tzalim chayavis b'peah. So we'll see imahos, what they are. They're parts of these onions that have an obligation in Peah. Imahos, the machos between the Chacham and Tanakh, Rabbi Yossi, we will explain in the Gemara. So usual onions are definitely chayav in Peah. And these imahos, we'll see what they are, also chayav, but Rabbi Yossi poiter, Rabbi Yossi exempts. Malbanos havetzalim. Now these are patches of onions, shebein hayorok, which are found between the vegetables, right? So the vegetables are separating between these patches of onions. You have gaps of vegetables in between. Rabbi Yossi says, Peah mikal echad ve'echad. Each patch needs its own peah because the vegetables are making a gap between the onion patches. So each patch of onions is a field in its own right, and it's got its own obligation of peah. You can give one love peah from all the patches for all of them because the vegetables are not considered a gap. Okay? Now, Rav said the word imahos. What does it mean imahos? So Rav says it's pulgara, which are big onions that you leave in the ground to grow them, to grow for seed, really. That's the reason. And they bring out the seeds for the onions, so they're called imahos shel b'tzalim. They're used for seed. Shmuel says sumachta. They grow from the remnants of the onion roots. When you uproot the onions, you remain bits of earth and bits of in the roots in the ground, a bit of the onion, and new onions grow from that. Now, according to Rav, they're the big onions that remain in the ground. So Rabbi Yossi pattern because they're not really fitting for eating. According to Shmuel, that reason doesn't apply because they grow from the remnants of the roots. They are fitting for eating like ordinary onions. So then, what's the reason of Rabbi Yossi according to Shmuel? So Rabbi Yaakov Abud b'Shem Rochani. Now, Rabbi Yossi didn't say his din according to Shmuel. There's a totally different reason. It's because the owner is not particular. If you taste them, hefka of course is ownerless, is potter from peah. And that's why there was an exemption, because they're just left behind and no one wants them. Rabbi Bud Bachir Voy Kume Rabbana, he asks, according to the Chachamim then, who argue, Hefka Chai B'Peah, if it's Hefka, and they're saying you are obligated with Peah, everyone agrees that Hefka is part of from Peah, so Amalet, he answered back, when the Balabais gathers the onions, he intends to acquire them for himself. And the Chachamim hold, the onions, yeah, they were Hefka, but now he's gone back and acquired them, they are obligated in Peah. You see, that's what the Tanakh holds. Rabbi Yossi holds, the Balabais is like an ordinary person. When you acquire something from Hefka, it's ownerless, and therefore it's exempt. So the Chachamim have retained the Peah obligation on the Balabais when he starts picking up these onions. Whereas Rabbi Yossi said, no, they're Hefka, so they don't have an obligation. Okay? The hard time. But we've learned in a Brayso that the Chachamim said to Rabbi Yossi on his din that they are exempt from Peah. And what did they say to him? Now, it's true, when you have a lot, you're not going to bother to pick them. But when you've got a small amount, you will bother to collect them. Now, what do you see from that? Have a less tama delay. You must say that the reason is, now delay of course is short for dar ella. Yeah, or is Yerushalmi delay is dar ella. So what is the reason? Is only the reason why Rabbi Yossi must have exempted them, mishum, not because of the hefka reason, but mishum machnisa lekiyum. The reason is because they're not kept. Rabbi Yossi held, usually people don't keep these onions. They're not kept for storage for a long time, and that was one of the requirements, right, for Peah. It's got to be something that lasts. Therefore, the Chachamim answered him, there are situations where you are keeping these things, these onions. It's considered keeping for a while, and it has a Peah obligation. So you see from here, not like Rav Chanina, who said the reason is because of Hefka. It's not because of Hefka. It's the question of whether something is kept to last or not, whether it stays for a while. Okay? Now, brothers have inherited a field, and they've divided the fields between the two of them, and it's not yet been harvested. They've already divided the field. It's not been harvested. So they have two halves. So each one gives Peah for his share. If they now join up again before the cutting, and now they all combined, they own the fields in all of it, Nosim Peah Achas, then they only have to give one lot of Peah, because it's now they're combined again to become like one field. Okay? It depends what sort of ownership they have. Now, although in the Torah Peah, the obligation says Sadachah, which is Lashon Yachid, you might think, well, if it's owned by partners, maybe there's no obligation, but it is Chaim with Peah if it's owned by partners, because you find the beginning of the pasuk, Kasir Al Tzechem, right? It's in plural. So even a field belonging to two is obligated in Peah. Okay? Let's carry on. So what have we got? Shnaim Shlach Es Ha'ilan, two who acquire a tree in a partnership. Nosim Peah Achas, one little pear from the tree. Lokas Esvay Nai Bezerdrom. If one took the north side and one took the south side, Zenos Peah Achas, Zenos Peah Achas. But then again, each one has to give Peah on their particular side. Okay? Right, each one. So you find even with a tree, even though the branches and nourishment comes from the same place, but if it's divided up, we sort of divide it up like we divide a field, so they each have to come from separate sides. Now, Karza, the first part of the Mishnah, we spoke about brothers who divided a field before we started cutting it. And what about when the partners divide the field after we've already started cutting? So now what happens? So Karza, Chatzi Soder, one partner cuts half the field b'shutfus, while they both owned in entirety the whole field. And one partner started cutting. And then, the Choku, now they've sort of divided the field, and now the partner who's cut his half, right, he took that half. Yes? Let's say that again? Yeah, we're paying Halacha Daled, yeah? So let's start again. So, two partners own a field in its entirety. At this moment in time, one of the partners goes and starts cutting half the field. After he's cut half the field, they now say, we won't own the field in its entirety anymore. We will each have a half each. Right? Well, we're not talking about Brera here, but with Yerushalmi, well, it doesn't come on to Brera actually very much. But, so what's happened? So he's cut half on the understanding it was for both of them. Now, he's cut his half, and they decide to change it so that one will have half and one will have the other half. So now, and the second one now takes the other second. So the second one takes the half that's not yet cut, and the first one takes the half that he has already cut. Now the first partner, Eina Mafresh B'Shaloi, he doesn't have to be Mafresh Peah for the half that he has already cut. When he cut that half, Peah wasn't going to be taken out there. Peah was going to be left what's remaining in the field. From the remaining half. You never take Peah out of what you've cut. You leave Peah for what's left behind. So when he cut that half, Peah wasn't going to be taken from there. Now later on they change it, and now he ends up only with the half that he's already cut. So in such a case, Eina Mafish B'Shalai, he doesn't have to separate Peah for the half he's already cut. Loi B'Tchila, not from the half that you already cut, that's already cut. And there was no Chiyuv Peah unless it's Mechuba, right? Unless it's connected to the ground. But Loi B'Soif, nor is he going to separate Peah for his half from his partner's half, which is going to be cut. Because then already there's a new partnership in place now. And that new partnership, the share of the second partner, has got nothing to do with what he received in the first half. You understand? What the second partner gets is nothing to do with the first guy now.
He didn't get any of the first half.
Who didn't get? No, so what we're saying is when the second person now gets his half, which he's about to deal with, he has no obligation to leave anything for the first guy's share in the first half.
Yes.
That's all we're saying.
Yeah.
I'm glad you agree. Now, if those partners, after they divided the field, chazru v'nishtatzvu, right, they now say we will go back into a partnership. Right? So remember, it's the same case. So first they were partners. Then one went and cut his half. Now they agree we will go back into a partnership. Cuts through, and now the second one cuts the second half, cuts through Chatzi Asadeh, B'Shutvus, as part of the partnership. So the shutuf that cuts the second half, he is able, mafrish mishalai shabasayf, he can now separate from his share in the end, al chavera shabasayf, from his half, his share in the second half, for his friend in the second half, because now they're all a partnership again. He can mafrish one lot peah for the whole second half, right? For the whole second half, he can be mafrish one lot peah. Avaloi mishalai shabetchila al chavera shabetchila. He cannot separate from his share in the first half for his friend's share in the first half, right? Nor can he actually separate for his share in the first half either. So he can't do either. Not for his friend. So he can't now separate in the second half for his share in the first half. Remember, they're now partners again. So he can't separate from his share in the second half for what was before the arrangement when the first one cut in the first half. So he can't separate for his own in the first half, even though now he's going to get a share in the first half because they're now partners over the whole thing. You understand? He can't separate from his share in the first half for his friend's share in the first half. He also can't separate for his share in the first half because the whole first half was exempt from a pay obligation at the time when they divided up the field. Because at the time they divided up the field, the payer was it became exempt basically, once they decided to separate it out. So that's what's going to happen. So he doesn't have to separate now, as we said, from his share in the second for his share in the first, or for his friends in the first. Okay? He doesn't have to, basically he's not obligated to leave payer on his share in the first half. The first half was exempt from any payer obligation, right? Let's carry on. Amar Rav Yochanan said, Katza Chatzi Sadeh. If he started cutting half the field, because this is a new case now, a person thinks, he starts cutting half the field, and he thinks, you know what, I'll sell the rest. But Katza, and he managed to only cut Chatzi Chetzia. So out of the half that he wanted to cut, he only cut half of that. So he only cut a quarter. Right, the first quarter of the field is what he's cut. He's not yet managed to cut the second quarter, which he wanted to cut. Ad shekarza es kula. In the end, basically he changed his mind. I won't start selling the rest. And what did he do? Karza es kula, huh? Oh, it's so basically he's now cut. Kind of would be he acquired it and he's not going to sell it. So karza es kula. So he's cut everything now. So let's remind ourselves now. So what has he done? He was going to cut half. He ended up cutting a quarter. He's not able to cut the rest. Basically, he's changed his mind. He's not going to sell the rest. And karza es kula. He ended up cutting the remaining 3 quarters. So the deal is, mafrish, he can separate peah min harishon aleim soim from the first quarter for the second quarter. Now the second quarter, always the intention was going to be the same as the first quarter, right? He was going to cut half. So the original intention was the second quarter would be exactly the same as the first quarter. So he can separate peah, first quarter for the second quarter. Min soim al harishon, second quarter for the first quarter, because they were identical really. The intention was that they would be identical. Because at the time when he started cutting, his intention was to cut the 2 quarters together, and there was a chiyuv peah on the 2 quarters together, so you can separate peah one for the other. Ve'ena mafrish min harishon, he cannot separate from the first quarter ala achron on basically the last half, right? Because they're totally different. By achron here, they say some have a gisa Roshin, the other Roshin, one Roshin from Roshin, the 2 edges. You can't separate first quarter for the third quarter or for the fourth quarter. You can't do that. Because when he cut the first quarter, he had no intention to cut the second half. He had no chiyuv peah at that time. And since the first quarter and the second half did not have a pay obligation together, you can't be mafresh one for the other. Jubilee said, if you had one field, half of it has reached a third in growth and has a pay obligation. And half of it has not yet grown a third. And he starts cutting the half which has grown a third. He's not yet managed to cut even the first quarter. Yeah, he wants to cut half, but he's not yet managed to cut even a quarter. And now the whole thing has grown a third. So meanwhile, until he got around to it, everything started growing. It's now the whole thing has grown a third. And then he finishes cutting his field. Mafresh min harishon aleim sa'im. He is allowed to separate peah from the first quarter for the second quarter. Min aleim sa'im, and from the second quarter al harishon on the first quarter, because the second quarter already grew a third when he started cutting the first quarter. Therefore, the chiyuv peah was there at that time. So the first two quarters both have their obligation together, and therefore it can be mafresh one for the other. The Eina mafresh min harishon al ha'achron. But he cannot separate peah from the first quarter for the second half. Because at the time when he cut the first quarter, he's not yet brought, the second half has not yet reached a third, right? When he started cutting the first quarter, at that point when he started cutting, it hadn't grown a third, and therefore there was no chiyuv peah at that time. You follow that? So again, same idea. So the first quarter can cover the second quarter, but he can't start covering the second half. Okay? Let's carry on. Halacha hey. Right, a person is selling small trees. Now these small trees, they're growing, but they're within his field. So basically, the person who's going to buy the fruits, these trees, you're not going to keep them there. They're growing in a field. They're like klachim. They're like, a mess, really. Usually you would uproot the trees from the field and plant them elsewhere. Okay, so here what's happening, he's selling the trees to someone else. The person who acquires it will gather the fruit, and after that he'll uproot these trees and put them in his field. So these trees are not going to stay here. So the person who's selling these small trees that have grown, within his field, and usually the intention is the person will end up uprooting them. So the person is not, so the time when the person gathers the fruit, he has to separate peah from each of the trees. The person who buys it bought the trees without any ground in between, because the trees are going to be uprooted. So he's bought the trees without any ground. So there's nothing which connects the trees to make them to be considered as one field. You follow? Because you're just buying the trees. He has no right in the land. There's nothing to join up these trees. So you have to separate peah from each tree until they're all uprooted into their new area. Oh, Rabbi Yehuda, when do we say give peah from each one? If the owner of the field didn't keep any trees for himself, he sold all the trees to the purchaser. If the owner of the field has left for himself even one tree, he has to separate peah for all the trees that have been purchased. You follow? Keeping one tree for himself, the seller has to keep paying peah for all the trees that have been bought. Okay? Right. So here the chiyuv is on the moicher, not on the buyer. And the land between the trees belongs to the seller. So all the trees are like one field. So the seller can leave one lot peah for the lot. Okay? Now, if the seller keeps behind, we said leaves a bit for himself, he gives peah for everything. Ad kedol, that's all very well, that the seller has to be mafresh, kishehischil liksar, when the seller started cutting fruit before the sale. So therefore the seller had a chiyuv of peah on the whole field, and even if afterwards he sells some of the fruits, the chiyuv of peah remains, and he has to give peah for the whole field. Okay? So that's where he started cutting a bit before the sale. Now what about every case? Do you have to give peah afilu lo hischil liksar? What about if the person never started cutting at all? Do we still put the whole obligation on the seller? So the Gemara brings a similar din, which we find elsewhere. We learn from the following. Right. A person buys, the fleece of his friend before he's been cut off the sheep. As mitzvah reishes our gaze, right? So you're selling this fleece before it's been cut off the sheep. If Shir HaMoicha, if the seller left for himself a portion of this fleece, then HaMoicha Chaim, then the seller has to give Reishis Hageiz for the whole thing, even on what he sells. V'im Lav, but if he didn't leave anything for himself, he sold it all, Halakeach Chaim, then the purchaser has to give the Reishis Hageiz. And Rabbi Yehuda said, B'Shem Rabbi Yochanan, this is Rabbi Yehuda. This is the view of Rabbi Yehuda. So it's just like Rabbi Yehuda said in our Mishnah, that when you sell trees, you leave a few trees for yourself, you separate Peah for the whole thing. So one who sells the fleece, the wool, if he leaves a bit of wool for himself, he has to give Reishis Hageiz on the whole wool. But the other one says no. So let's see. Now, how we can answer our question. So Shani Tamad. Now, does it make a difference? Actually, it's a question. Is it different? Shani Tamad, is there a difference between Hischel Ligzais, whether the seller started cutting between July Hischel Ligzais, or he's not started cutting? We don't make any difference. With Reishis Hageiz, there's no difference if he started cutting or not. Every situation, you don't have to give what's not been cut. There's no obligation yet when it's not been cut. But Rabbi Yehuda is mechayev the seller with Reishis Hageiz. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the chiyuv is on the seller, even if he's not yet obligated in it before the sale. The same thing here with Peah. Therefore, there's no difference. So whether he started cutting from the trees before the sale, he didn't start cutting before the sale. In every situation, the seller is hired to be mafresh the Peah. Okay? There's no difference. What difference does it make? So the Gemara proves that Yehuda is mechayev the seller with Peah, even if he wasn't yet obligated before the sale. Now, what's the reason of Yehuda? What's the reason of Yehuda then? Is it mishum techayvas katzer bekama? The chiyuv Peah on what's been cut is bekama, is what's left at the end. And since the seller is cutting the last trees, right? He's cutting the trees. He has a chiyuv Peah because he'll be left with everything, I suppose, later on. Is that the reason? Right? He's cutting like the later trees. He has a chiyuv Peah. It says over here, he's selling these kachei ha'ilan, as he said. The lekeach will uproot them. The trees of lekeach are going to be cut first, and the tree that the seller leaves for himself will be cut much later on. And since the ikar din of Peah is to leave Peah for what's remaining and what's growing in the field, therefore the seller will be left with the last tree. You follow? So he will have the chiyuv to be mafresh for the whole field. Okay? So let's see now. So Ma'atam Yehuda, is it mishum dechayvas katzeh bekara? The chiyuv is on what's remaining at the end, and since the seller is going to be the last one cutting the trees, he has the chiyuv. Maybe it's like you're selling the trees apart from the Peah obligation. You as a buyer will not be obligated in Peah. It's like a stipulation in the sale that the seller is taking upon himself the Peah obligation. Is that what it is? So is it because he'll end up cutting the last tree? Or is it because the sale was on condition that the buyer does not have a Peah obligation? We can learn from the following. If a person bought the shearings of the sheep from Israel before the cutting, if the seller left a bit for himself, then the seller is chayav Reishis Hageiz for all the shearings from what stays in his domain. If he's not leaving anything for himself, then the one who buys it has to give Reishis Hageiz. He said this din is Rabbi Yehuda, is like the view of Rabbi Yehuda. So again, how are we going to learn our answer to our question? He says, can you honestly say in Reishis Hageiz, right, the seller is giving Reishis Hageiz the shearings for the buyer because chayvas katzeh bekama, just like the pay obligation is what's left at the end. That doesn't apply with shearings, right? You can't tell me. Can you honestly say the chiyuv of the shearings that the buyer cuts is like a giza on the seller that remains connected to the sheep and connected to the ground? Doesn't make sense, right? You follow? It's not like Peah that the remaining thing, the chiyuv, is what's left at the end. You don't find that with shearings of sheep, right? No, we don't say that. With Reishis Hageiz, the chiyuv is you give what's cut to the Cohen, right? And not what's left connected to the sheep. Right? It's the opposite of Peah. Peah, the chiyuv, is what's left at the end. Here it's the first cuttings you give to the Cohen, right? You have to say the true reason why the seller is chayav to give for the purchaser because the seller arranged a condition, a stipulation, as far as the Chiyuv Reishis HaGeis, to sell the Lekach, the shearings, that they will have no obligation to give anything to the Cohen. The same thing, therefore, with Peah as well. The reason why the seller is mafresh from the purchaser, because the seller is b'macharei chutz m'chavasai. The seller took upon himself the Chiyuv Peah to exempt the purchaser from his obligation. Okay, so that's what's happening over here. He's going out of his way to exempt the purchaser from any Chiyuv of being mafresh Peah, whatever it is. Okay, right. What's the difference between the two explanations? He says if the purchaser went v'hifrish and he separated Peah from the trees that he bought. In Tema, if you're going to tell me the Chiyuv remains with what's left at the end, then hifrish, what the purchaser did separate, hifrish, he separated it. And he's not going to, what he's done, he's done. He's not going to get paid back for that. He shouldn't have done it. But in Tema, if you're going to tell me it's like you're selling the trees with no obligation to give Peah, so the seller is obligating to give Peah, then even hifrish, if the lekach, the purchaser, did separate, I'm afraid it's not going to take away the obligation from the seller. But noitel mimenu damim, and the purchaser will be entitled to a money arrangement from the seller. Yeah, basically he can get some money back from the seller, right? It was the seller's obligation, and the purchaser went and took it on himself. So we're saying he really had no obligation to, but hifrish, if he did, then at least he will be able to take some money for that, for the Peah that he separated. I agree, he had no chiyuv to do it. What we're saying is like this: the real obligation is on the purchaser, right? But the moicha took on himself that chiyuv like a monetary obligation instead of the purchaser. So in a situation where the purchaser did the Peah himself, the moicha is not yet obligated. Sorry, he's not exempt from separating the Peah. He has to maybe pay off the lekeach for what he's done. He has to pay the lekeach for the Peah that was separated. You follow? So there's a monetary obligation on the seller, and this buyer has gone and separated something. The seller will have to pay back for that. Another nafkamina would be nisraf chelka shamoicha. If the seller's share before it got cut got burnt, right? Before the buyer went and bought it, and the seller's bit has got burnt, right? That last tree of the seller, that's got burnt, and the lekeach hasn't yet cut his share. In time, if you're going to tell me that the seller gives Peah for the buyer, because it's what's remaining in the end, then nisraf, what's been burnt has been burnt. And therefore the purchaser will have to separate Peah for his share, and he's not going to get any money for it. That's what's left, I'm afraid. You have to separate Peah for that. But in time, if you're going to tell me that, there's a dispensation, that he's letting the purchaser get out of it, and that the seller will take on the financial amount, and he will pay back whatever is his responsibility of the seller, then nisraf, if the share of the moicha got burnt, the buyer is not going to lose out. But noita mimenu damim, he will be able to take some money from the seller, because it's really the seller's obligation, and he's got out of it, got burnt. Now the buyer will do it on his behalf. He will get some money back. Okay? Reb Lezer, halacha ba. Reb Lezer said the area you can sow a quarter of a kav is of seed is chayav Peah, right? It's you're sowing a quarter of a kav of seed has a Peah obligation. Okay, quarter kav is 6x. Reb Lezer holds it's the smallest amount. It's an area of 104 and a 6 square amas. Right, it's 10.2 times 10.2. It's learned from the Mishkan. Right, it says in the Torah the Chatzah of the Mishkan was 100 by 50, 5,000 square amas. And in that area you can sow 2 sah. The sah has 6 kav. So 1 sah is 24 quarter kav. 2 sah is 48 quarter kav. So the area we can sow a quarter kav is a 48th of 5,000, which is 104.16, etc. square amas. Okay? Now, who else have we got? An area that produces produces, not the seed, but produces crops to that amount of 2 sa. Rav Tarfon he said shisha tvachim. Even land the share of 6 by 6 tvachim is chayv b'peah. Rav Masechet he said keliksa b'lishnos. Even land that has a shiur, you need to be able to cut it twice. Right? It's got to have like 2 lots of growth there. The Mishnah says Allah is like him. Pashas we don't pass him like him actually. The Rambam doesn't pass him like him. You find cases where it says halacha like this, but we don't actually pass him like that. Okay. We pass him like the Kiva in the next Mishnah. Okay. Now, what about the 3 shittas in the Mishnah? Let's see. What's Rabbi Lezer's source? Why does he say Karka Beis Rova? Ne'emar Kan, it says with Peah Sabcha. Don't finish off your field. And never with Kalayim. Kalayim you find Sabcha. Don't sow your field Kalayim. Ma Sabcha Shenemar, just like the one there is Beis Rova, is a quarter kav of seed of Kan, so with Peah as well, Beis Rova is a quarter kav. Right? Not to be over this, so Kalayim, you have to separate the shear of Beis Rova. They have to be separated out from each other. Okay, otherwise it's considered one field. Okay. The truth is, the gap between vegetables is 6 tvachim. Why don't we say the gap in the field, which is for vegetables and so on? Alright, let's move on. Ma'atam Risha. What's the reason of Risha? What did Risha say, Rabbi say? 2 sa. Never can sadcha, but never alone you find B'shachachta Omer Basadi. You'll forget the things in the field. And we learn Zosha. But Masada Shneman Alam. B'shekra is shir sasayim. It's a shir of 2 sa. Omer Basada. It doesn't actually say sasayim there to be considered a field, but the Chachamim said that is a shir. Okay. Afkan, so here's where we Peah is sasayim. The share of the crop is 2 sa. Ma'atav Rav Tarfon. What's Rav Tarfon's reason? What did Rav Tarfon say, Rabbi say? 6 by 6. Shisha, 6 by 6 is called a field. From the Din in Kanai, but Aruga, it talks about the various patches and how many patches you can have in the field. And the Aruga, which is 6 by 6, you can sow in it 5 types of grains. Remember the diagonal shapes and everything else, and the 4 sides and 1 in the middle, right? Yeah. And the reason is because Aruga is called a sadeh, and you'll sow many different types of seeds in different places. It doesn't look like a mixture, and that's where Rav Tarfon learned his din. The same thing with Peah, that the karka of that shear is considered a field. Sure, remember Sarah, he said, nice to be able to cut it and cut again. What does it mean cutting that Rav Shimon says? The people who cut a handful in one go, or maybe I feel a kosher, or maybe they cut a small bit in one, the smallest amount. In Masechet, it says, the person couldn't cut to get everything in his hand and cut. And the ma'amer, the one who's doing the bundles, to fill a whole garment of his, a whole full garment, and to make the bundle. Ada Amra, this tells me, Shektsira, Gederach HaKotrim. The cutting is like the way of the people who cut. You get a handful, but if it's less than that share, it's a derech klala, it's not considered cutting. So when Yerushalmi Peah Daf said Kaliliksa, his command is a whole handful, as it were. Yeah? So a whole handful, and he wanted that twice, didn't he? He wanted 2 lots of handfuls. Liksa b'lishnos. So he wanted sort of 2 lots of handfuls there. Okay. Alright. Okay. Yeah, let's carry on. Halacha Zayin, yeah? Rabbi Kiva Eimer. Karka Koshu. Rabbi Kiva said the smallest bit of land, Chayeves Peah. Even a small bit of land is Chayev Peah. Even, okay. The smallest piece of land is enough for Mashiach, right? The Taltalim can be acquired with Mashiach, the Kinyanagav, whatever it is. You can acquire it with land. So even a small piece of land, Chayeves Peah, over Bikurim, is the first roots. V'lechta v'la prosbul. Not prosbul if you have land during the Shemitah year. To acquire movable things, together with land. Right? You bring it into your rishus. Land is acquired through kesef, shtar, or ma'aseh chazaka. Usually these things, Derech and Kinyan, don't help with metaltalin. You acquire the metaltalin together with land, you get Kinyan agav. Okay? Right, let's carry on. So what is he doing? The person is giving away part of his estate. Shchibra, when he is the Shchibra. So he's very ill. So the din is, Shir Karka Kosher, if he kept a small bit of land for himself, his gift to the others is valid. So even if he gets better, the gift has been given away, and they keep it, even if he gets better. Lo Shir Karka Kosher, if he kept nothing for himself, he gave everything away, then if he gets better, then the gifts don't last, and he gets everything back. Because by giving others what he has, he's doing it because he thinks he's not going to get better. Had he known he was getting better, he wouldn't have given everything and left himself anything. So if he gets better, then the matana is butter. So if he gives everything away and he gets better, then he gets it all back. A person who writes things away to his sons in the will, because for the Ishta Karka Kosher, he gave his wife a small bit of land and she was happy with that. Ivda, as she has lost the right to claim her Ksuvah from that which was given to the sons. Now, although land which is given to her is not really the value of the Ksuvah, but she's accepted that. Rabbi Yossi says, in Kibla Aleha, if she took upon herself the division, what does it mean? If she agreed to the division, even though he didn't actually write any land, she's also lost the right to claim a Ksuvah from the Nechasim which he's given to the sons. So Rabbi Yossi holds, if she is happy with the division, that's it. Even though he didn't actually write any land, he didn't mention that she's got any land. Okay. Rabbi Kiva, that's actually what he says here. Some learn actually in Bavli, the din of Karka Koshehu is lav dafka. They say it's not enough, you need to give land you can live on. Provide some sustenance from it. That's how some want to learn in Bavli. Alright.
Someone's borrowed and he gives everything. Where does his skills come from during that period? He's at the end and then.
Yeah, the Shemra, yeah. He gives everything away.
If you give it, so what's his skills? Who's the state?
I know, but he obviously thinks he's not going to live. So when he lives, he gets it back. So here we're talking about this woman, and she's happy with a bit of land. So there's a question of what sort of land we're talking about. Okay. Rabbi Kiva who says Karka Kosher. Smallest bit of land is Chaim Peah. Rabbi Yossi Lakish by Hagatzmacha. He said, wait a minute. We can learn from this. There's one piece of land, just one stalk growing there, is Chaim Peah. But how can you say that? Until you cut it, ain't kan chiv. There's no chiv pay. You don't need pay until after the beginning of the cutting. And Misha cuts that. Once you cut it, ain't kan chiv. There's nothing left. Tifta, you can explain it. There's one stalk there. I said, I suppose one stalk with 5 ears coming out of it somehow. Right? Is that what they say there? Five bits coming out of it. So if you didn't cut the thing close to the ground, you cut, let's say, first one stalk coming out, one ear coming out, you have to pay at least one of the 5 which is not cut. You leave behind one of the 5. Rabbana said, but listen, Amrid, didn't we say, we never said, Kama kol she'ichayev pepeah, right? We never said the smallest amount standing is chayav pepeah. We said land. Now why does the Mishnah say karka when the din is you have to leave peah from that which is left behind standing, even if you don't have any land under it? I mean, even if you've got no land, you still have to give peah. The Mishnah should have said kama koshehu, really. Kama koshehu, wherever's growing, left standing. It doesn't depend on the land. Not that the land is chayav peah. Ela begins to Tana Bikurim, because we tell you din of Bikurim, which you don't have to bring them unless you've got land. Tana Kalka. So the Mishnah said the din of land as well as far as peah is concerned. But it would have been better to say Kama Koshehu, really, because there's no need that the owner of the land, you don't need land to be chayav peah. Tani, we learned in the Brisa, Re'ayon, the mitzvah of Re'iyah and the Beis HaMikdash on the 3 festivals is only if you have land. Yeah, someone who hasn't got land does not have to be the Re'iyah and the Beis HaMikdash. There's no chiyuv unless at least you have land. There's different Torah in the Haggadah about that. You remember Sarah and all that, they didn't have land. Rabbanah why don't we say the Brisa Noah did? Misha in the Kak, you've got no land. Potim in Avidoy. You don't have to say the Vidoy Maestros when you bring the Bikurim Lashon, yeah? The Siv, he says, the land you've given us. Sounds like only someone who has land can say this vidui, and that's pasha, that even the smallest bit of land is enough. There's no share in the Torah. So why don't the Brisa add on the Mishnah of the vidui maser as well? You need to have the smallest bit of land. Very good question. The Gemara doesn't actually answer it, but it strengthens the Nacha Rabbana. It says, Shmuasa came, what's accepted is like that. Misha ein le'karka, sure enough, if you don't have land, partam in avidoi, you are exempt from vidui. You see it? It says, Vas ha'adama, asher nasata lanu. Right, the land that you gave us. That is what's accepted, and that is the halacha. Although we had one question without an answer, so there we are. Now, Brak 2, bringing a makor for the din of someone who's got no land, is partam from Riyah. Yes, you don't have to go to the Azara 3 times a year if you've got no land. Shanera says, people will not desire your land when you go up to see Hashem. So as you see, the mitzvah to be seen in the regalim is someone who's got land. We have a person who forgot. He left in his field without guarding, he goes on a regal. He finds lions guarding it to guard the produce from the thieves. Someone else. In the he leaves all his chickens there, and he goes on a regal, he comes back. And he finds cats had come along to take the chickens, and they were all torn up in front of the chickens. The derech neis, something happened to the cats. Person left his house open. He finds the snake at the lock over there to stop anyone coming in. He said this story. 2 brothers in Ashkelon had non-Jewish neighbors. The neighbors said, when the Jewish people go to the regal, we'll take all that they have. When the Jewish people came back, when they went, Hashem made angels look in the appearance of the Jewish people. So it looked like the Jewish people were there all the time. So the Goyim thought that the Jewish people were still around. When the Jewish people came back, they sent gifts to their non-Jewish neighbors. The neighbors said, they said, where were you? They said, Yerushalmi. They said, who did you leave in the house? They said, no one. They said, blessed be the God of the Jews. He won't leave you. He doesn't forsake you. Okay? This idea, I think they discussed it. They brought a gift for their non-Jewish neighbors. Why did they do that? Yerushalmi's got different shitters about giving gifts to God. Huh? Yeah, is there anything in the discussion about this? Yerushalmi seems to say, Yerushalmi, although you shouldn't give matana to a guy, you're allowed to give matana to trading goyim, because for that, you get tovas acheres, they do other good deeds back. It's like a sale and not a gift.
That's how we pass them anyway, even a
Yeah?
Yeah.
If you get something back, yeah. Okay. Just want to see, is there anywhere? I guess the bottom of the page. You can acquire a small bit of land with kesef shtar chazaka. How do you know that movable things can be acquired together with land? See if it says, with the gifts that Yehoshaphat, king of Yehuda, gave to his sons, together with the cities of Yehuda. So you see, the movable things were acquired together with the cities. And that's what the pasuk is telling you. Otherwise, you should have said ve'ore. That's all very well, because but everything was in one place. As you understand, but what about if the land is here and the movables are somewhere else? Could they still be acquired together? We learn from the following. Says the Chachamim. Now they paskin that Shchibara is chal without doing a masa kinyan. He says masa b'Meroni echad. There was someone from Meroni. This is a place called Moron. And what happens? Shahayim Yerushalayim. He had all these movable things. He wants to give them as a gift. The Chacham said, you can't do it. You have to acquire land, and then you can be makle the matana to the people receiving it as a kinyan agav by giving them over the land And together with the land, they acquire the movable things. Me'asa, what did he do? He bought one rock in the side of Yerushalmi. The north side, and gives to so-and-so with 100 barrels of wine. The south side of the rock, and 100 barrels of oil. And he did all the kinyanim to give all tiny parts of the rock to all the people getting the gifts. And then he dies. The Chasuri came to the Chachamim, they accepted his words. They said that the one who receives it, they acquire the oil, they acquire the wine. And the vine they had to do a kinyan, although he was a shchimra, you see, even someone who's dying can't be makna nechasim unless they have a Masechet kinyan. So this brisa proves to you, you can acquire metaltalin with land, even if it's not in one place. Because this story, the metaltalin and the land were not in the same place. The land was this rock, which was a sharp rock. You couldn't put 100 barrels on this sharp rock. Nevertheless, the Chachamim said that the kinyan helped. He says, wait a minute. Maybe why he could do it, because he was shchibara. They were lenient more than other people. Usually you give land, you need a shtar. The Khan, and here he gave it afilu b'dvarim, even with words. And it could be according to Rebbe Lezer then, the kinyan of Moroni helped, doesn't normally help. The fee, because the shchibara, shebechal makom in every place, it's a kinyan agav of a healthy person. Everything will be in one place. The Chad, maybe shchibara, maybe here, maybe the land was here and the movables were there. So it comes out, it could be the kinyan helps in this situation, even though the metaltalin is not gathered together with the land. It's just because it was a shchibara, you can't necessarily learn from here to a healthy person. They say here, why could he not do a kinyan chalipin? One of the people there will give his own thing to Moroni, and he will acquire back the gift for all the other people. And it could be no one was prepared to give their pen, right? No one was prepared to give an item to him. They were worried that Moroni will leave it for himself. And even though usually the makler gives back the item for chalipin, but there's no chiyuv to do that, and he could have kept it in his own domain. Rabbi, so thank you very much. If you do want to do any supporting of the shir, just get in touch on the ycdyerushalmi@gmail.com email. Thank you very much.